Last part we spent a lot of time discussing why there are so many versions of Galadriel and other characters in Tolkien's writings. We talked about her hair and the creation of the three Silmarilli. This time we talk about how Galadriel went to Middle-earth and the First Kinslaying. We of course also look into the question if Galadriel participated in that battle and into some other details, including her husband Celeborn. Here we already have three versions of her story that Tolkien wrote, and two of them contradict each other strongly. The whole version chaos makes it quite difficult to construct a consistent background story out of all the texts Tolkien wrote. My name is Chris, aka ThePhilosophersGames, and as always a few hints. I try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it. Shoutouts to the artists who allowed me to use their amazing artworks like Kimberly80, Ted Naismith, Sarah Morello, Jenny Dolphin. Oh, and this video is perfectly understandable without seeing the last part. Also, spoiler warning, I guess. Last part we looked into some additional information from the so-called Shibboleths of Feanor, written around 1968, published in Peoples of Middle-earth, which you could say expands what we find in the Silmarillion with some side notes, though this is not the main purpose of the text. For example, in it we find the story of Feanor asking for 3 hairs of Galadriel. In the story of Galadriel, we are still on the west continent, Aman, and not yet in Middle-earth, so very early in the story. There, the first Dark Lord Morgoth betrayed the Valar and the elves. Again, with the help of Shelob's powerful mother Ungoliant, the Dark Lord destroyed the 2 trees of Valinor, murdered Finwë, the king of the Noldor, that is one of the original 3 elven clans, stole the 3 Silmarilli, extremely powerful and beautiful gems, and escaped to Middle-earth, causing the darkening of Valinor, which resulted in the creation of sun and moon by the Valar, that are angels of highest rank who govern the world. At least that is the story we find in the Silmarillion. After these terrible events, many of the Noldor were convinced by Feanor, the eldest son of the Noldor king, to go with him to Middle-earth and bring Morgoth to fall, revenging their king and retrieving the 3 Silmarilli. He even swore an oath with his 7 sons to get the Silmarilli back into his possession by any means necessary. There are many more details surrounding Feanor in this time, like that he was also influenced by Morgoth for some time, resulting in him threatening his half-brother Fingolfin. Further, there was a shift in their language which fueled tensions between the Noldor further, and Feanor refused to give the 3 Silmarilli to the Valar so that they could recreate the 2 trees of Valinor out of them, but that would sidetrack us too much. I told this story many times by now in other videos. Now, the most common version of Galadriel that describes her in this early time, and that most people familiar with the lore know, is from the Silmarillion. It fits well to what we know from, for example, The Lord of the Rings. So we will look at it first. In the writing process, Tolkien wrote a version of the timeline of the elves living in Aman around 1937 to 1938, when he began writing Lord of the Rings. Galadriel does not appear in that original version. About 1951, when the story of Lord of the Rings was already completed, he revisited this timeline to, for example, add the elven characters he invented for Lord of the Rings in the meantime. He called it Annals of Aman, published in Morgoth's Ring, and this is the foundation of what we find in the Silmarillion we know today. So what happens there? Feanor speaks to his people after his father's death and convinces them to confront Morgoth in Middle-earth for what he has done. This is called the Rebellion of the Noldor. Many people were moved by his words, and about Galadriel we can read, "But Galadriel, the only woman of the Noldor to stand that day tall and valiant among the contending princes, was eager to be gone. No oath she swore, but the words of Feanor concerning Middle-earth had kindled in her heart, for she yearned to see the wide, unguarded lands and to rule there a realm at her own will." It's important to highlight no oath she swore, because it seems Tolkien always wanted her not to be in the same boat, pun not intended, as Feanor, but he still needed to get her to Middle-earth, and in most versions the argument for doing so was pride and founding her own realm. I guess connecting her to the oath of her uncle would have required a lot of reworks in the story of Feanor and his sons, which, as said, existed long before Galadriel was invented in 1941. On top of that, the oath turned into a curse, and doom was upon those who swore it, which is not fitting to Galadriel, who survived in Middle-earth while all others perished. The next step by Feanor and the Noldor who followed him was to find a way to get them to Middle-earth. Having ships would be great, and the clan of the Teleri elves lived at the coast in the city Alqualonde and were great mariners. As such, they had these Swann ships, and good old Feanor went there and claimed them. The Teleri did not want to give him their ships though. For that there were several reasons. The ships were part of their culture and their masterpieces of their beloved art of building ships. Feanor also would not sacrifice his Silmarillion to remake the two trees, though nobody knew that they were already stolen by Morgoth when he was asked. In addition, the Valar did not recommend going to Middle-earth, and after this conflict with the Teleri started, the Valar warned them to not go, and if they did, it would result in a powerful doom upon them in Middle-earth and a ban from Aman. Even though this doom was given later, it was clear that the Valar were no fans of the idea of the Noldor before things escalated. There is evidence for that, we come to that in a moment. As a result, giving the Noldor their ships could have been seen as unwise. I could imagine if the Teleri believed in Feanor's cause as well, giving up their ships would have been more acceptable to them, but that was definitely not the case. So Feanor and some of his people took the ships by force, and the Teleri defended against them, which resulted in bloodshed, and the Noldor slaying the only lightly armed Teleri. This event is called the First Kinslaying and happened in Alqualonde. Fingolfin's son Fingon also saw the battle and helped Feanor because he did not know what happened and saw his kin fighting and assumed the Teleri attacked first, so he helped. As mentioned, here we find evidence that the stance of the Valar was known before. What did Fingon and his people thought why the Teleri would attack Feanor? The Silmarillion gives an interesting answer, quote, "Some thought indeed that the Teleri had sought to waylay the march of the Noldor at the bidding of the Valar. This makes it clear that they knew the Valar disliked the endeavor, and they even expected severe consequences for doing so. As said, it's a rebellion of the Noldor against the Valar." Fingon was also a close friend of Maedhros, Feanor's eldest son, so of course he might help his friend before they knew rightly the cause of the quarrel, as Tolkien writes in the Silmarillion. With this, we have a huge chaos and bloodshed in Aman, a realm of peace, and this leads to a dark figure putting a powerful doom upon the Noldor and banning those who will leave Aman. The elves believe it was the Valar Mandos, or Namo, which is his actual name. He is the doomsman of the Valar, and I guess this makes most sense. I think the perspective of the Teleri is also often overlooked. What if they helped the Noldor, maybe even bringing them to Middle-earth on their ships? It's evident that it was known that this was against the will of the Valar, and though the powers would not stop the elves by force, this decision had consequences. Maybe it could have been seen as some kind of complicity, or in an extreme scenario bring the Teleri under the same doom as the Noldor. So if one asks why would they not just give up their ships, I think that also could have brought consequences to the Teleri, and on top of that they did not believe in Feanor's cause and wanted not to give up their masterpieces, the ships, same as Feanor. I think they had a very good reason to not help the Noldor from their perspective. And who speculates that in a realm of peace like Aman there would be actual bloodshed? So denying the request of Feanor was, in my opinion, very reasonable. The Kinslaying is also a turning point in Elvish history. This was pretty much the first time in history that elves slew each other, though it was not the first elf being slain in Aman. That was Feanor's father Finwë, who was slain by Morgoth. And this kinslaying happened in Aman, the continent and realm of the Valar, the forces of good. As you can imagine, nothing good can come from what Feanor did in Alqualondë. Further, it's interesting to see the elves behave like this. They seem more human in these stories, with pride and anger that escalates, even though men did not even exist yet in the Silmarillion version. Later Tolkien wanted to make them awake much earlier though. Of course, the elves were still young and less experienced, and you need those characters with rough edges to generate the needed conflicts in a story. Not all elves can be as wise as Finarfin or as the elves we know from The Lord of the Rings. Else we would have no story, and men were not around yet to fill that role, so Tolkien had to make the elves more human, I guess. Further, these stories are in parts very old, and Tolkien's vision of his world and the elves for sure changed over the decades. However, in the Silmarillion, it's not mentioned what Galadriel's role in the kinslaying was. That is different in another version, though we come to that in a moment. Her mother Eärwen was a Teler, and of course Galadriel's father, Finarfin, a Noldor with Vanyar blood, did not support his half-brother Feanor. He was wise, did not participate in the kinslaying, and stayed in Aman after hearing the warning of Mandos. As such, he did not fall under the doom. So there was still the option to avoid it, which in my opinion is very important in Tolkien's works. See the last few paragraphs of the Osanwe Kenta in Nature of Middle-earth. As said, the Valar did not hinder the elves by force, but gave them the option and explained what the consequences would be. The doom was the result of their action and choice, and not a magical curse put onto them. Still, Finarfin's children, Finrod, Angrod, Aegnor and Galadriel had different plans and wanted to leave Aman. All dreamed of unseen lands, and Galadriel wanted to create her own realm. From what we later learn when they speak to Thingol, king of the Sindar elves in Middle-earth, they did not participate in the kinslaying. Angrod said to Thingol, "Lord, I know not what lies you have heard, nor whence, but we came not red-handed. Guiltless we came forth, save maybe of folly to listen to the words of fell Feanor, and become as if besotted with wine, and as briefly." Further, we can read about the time of the rebellion. "And with Fingon stood as they ever did Angrod and Aegnor, sons of Finarfin, but these held their peace and spoke not against their fathers." And Finrod was with his friend Turgon, who spoke against Feanor as well, though both still went to Middle-earth and both had to make sacrifices for this decision. However, Feanor then used the stolen ships to sail to Middle-earth, but not all elves would fit on them. I guess the plan was to send them back and get the others while those waited in Aman, in the north, but Feanor had enough of his other relatives and thought that he does not need them anyway, so he decided to burn the ships in Middle-earth and leave his relatives in Aman. The oceans were not bent yet, and smoke could be seen by the others in Aman. However, they felt that they were now committed to the cause and did not want to beg the Valar for pardon after all what happened. Pride is a motive here. So they decided to take the hard way to Middle-earth, by which I do not mean swimming. Nobody would ever try that. They used the route over the cold wasteland of Helcaraxe. In the north was a lot of ice upon the ocean and connected the continents Aman and Middle-earth. Also Morgoth and Ungoliant used this path to escape. We can read, "The fire of their hearts was young, and led by Fingolfin and his sons, and by Finrod and Galadriel, they dared to pass the bitterest north, and finding no other way, they endured at last the terror of the Helcaraxe and the cruel hills of ice." Galadriel was now one of the leaders of the remaining Noldor as well. As said originally, she was not in this story, and this is how she came to Middle-earth in this version, which is, in my opinion, the one most people know. This journey also was very dangerous, and some elves died on the way, like Elenwe, the wife of Galadriel's cousin Turgon. I mentioned sacrifices. Finrod had to leave his beloved Amarie behind in Aman. The region the Noldor reached in Middle-earth at the end was called Beleriand, where the Sindar elves lived under King Thingol, and on their way one could see the first rise of the sun and moon, which were created out of the last fruit and flower of the two trees of Valinor. As said, without sacrificing the Silmarilli, the trees could not be restored, and Feanor did not want his masterpieces to be destroyed because he knew he will never make a greater work again. With the first sunrise, the years of the trees ended and the years of the sun began. In Beleriand, the Noldor elves united with their kin under King Thingol, but they of course did not tell them the whole story of what happened in Aman until a certain point. The Sindar elves are close kin to the Teleri. In Thingol's realm Doriath, Galadriel met the Sindar elf Celeborn and they fell in love. As a result, Galadriel stayed there most of the time and learned under the Maya Melian, who was the wife of Thingol. With this we reach halftime in this video. There might be a short ad break, and due to my abysmal subscriber gain I have to find ways to change this, so maybe use the moment to hit subscribe if you are interested in my Tolkien lore content. Much appreciated. Now we jump back to the First Kinslaying and look into a late prototype version Tolkien wrote. There is another version he wrote in between, the mentioned Shibboleth of Feanor from around 1968. Its purpose is a bit different and more linguistic, but we skip that for now. Interestingly, the late prototype version I want to discuss was written shortly before Tolkien died, so about August 1973, and is considered Tolkien's last writing regarding the Lord of the Rings universe. It's published in Unfinished Tales. In this version, Galadriel came to Alqualonde to be with her kin for a while. For her, living in Aman felt like living under the tutelage of the Valar, and her relatives by her mother's side had ships. So far, nothing too unusual compared to the other version. But now comes the biggest difference. In Alqualonde, she met a Teler elf who I assume she fell in love with, Celeborn. In this very late version, he is not a Sindar anymore, those elves who never went to Aman in the First Age, which seems to be a surprising change because in The Road Goes Ever On, which was published 1967, Celeborn is still a Sindar, and also Lord of the Rings hints at that. Tolkien worked on The Road Goes Ever On, and it was published during his lifetime. In it, his poems were made into songs, and he added some lore notes as well. It seems though he was not happy with the old version of Galadriel's story there, and brought a new idea to paper shortly before his death. The reason for that change, as Christopher Tolkien comments, was likely not for historical but for philosophical reasons. He wanted to disconnect Galadriel completely from what the Noldor did in the First Kinslaying and make her a special case in the lore and fit her later role as wise elven leader who passes the test by not taking the One Ring, and the metaphysical aspects of his world better. Christopher Tolkien also believed that his father was committed to this change, but it of course would have required to change Lord of the Rings and The Road Goes Ever On posthumously to avoid contradiction, which Christopher Tolkien did not want to do, so he had to reject this version for the Silmarillion. There are some more interesting details in this version. Galadriel and Celeborn built a ship together to escape the tutelage of Aman and sail to Middle-earth. This happens before the two trees were destroyed, so also before the rebellion of the Noldor. Galadriel had not the permission of Manwë, the king of the Valar, to leave yet. Now, when the trees were destroyed and the Silmarilli stolen, Feanor came to Alqualonde to demand the ships. Galadriel and Celeborn are mentioned. Indeed, she, with Celeborn, fought heroically in defense of Alqualonde against the assault of the Noldor, and Celeborn's ship was saved from them. So here, she and her husband got an active role in the First Kinslaying and fought at the side of the Teleri, even with so much success that their ship could be saved. and horrified by what happened, they sailed to Middle-earth. But without waiting for Manwë's leave, which would undoubtedly have been withheld in that hour, however legitimate her desire in itself, it was thus that she came under the ban set upon all departure, and Valinor was shut against her return. This brings us into the complex topic of Galadriel's ban, which we will discuss in a separate video. What is interesting in this version here is that she got under the ban of Manwë by accident. She wanted to depart anyway, independent from the events in Aman. Also, now Galadriel sailing to Middle-earth reflects how she, when she is a lot wiser later, leaves it again, which sets a frame around the story of Middle-earth in the Years of the Sun. In the mentioned Shibboleth of Feanor, with the in-between version, published in Peoples of Middle-earth, and this section is also in Unfinished Tales, we already find the idea of her defending her mother's kin, quote, though she, Galadriel, fought fiercely against Feanor in defense of her mother's kin. But Teleporno, or Teleporne, that is Celeborn, is not mentioned here. When Celeborn, which is Sindarin, was changed to a Teler in the last version, he needed a Telerin name. That is why this name Teleporno exists. If we look a bit into what happened in Middle-earth after the Noldor arrived, which we will also discuss in the next parts, Tolkien outlined the idea in this latest version that Galadriel's and Celeborn's counsel to the elves was, quote, to withdraw from Beleriand and to build up a power to the eastward, whence they feared that Morgoth would draw reinforcement, befriending and teaching the dark elves and men of those regions. To give you a bit more context, the elves, as said, came to Middle-earth to fight Morgoth, so they went there for war. Even though they had some success in this at times, it did not go well, and at the end Galadriel and her husband left Beleriand over the Blue Mountains early in the Years of the Sun part of the First Age. Tolkien, in my opinion, tried to avoid to add her to all the stories of the late First Age, of which there are plenty. However, in this context, Tolkien again disconnects Galadriel from the other elves and their fate. She maybe has the right idea here from the start, but the elves were not ready for such a retreat yet. And so she leaves Beleriand to the east and has nothing to do with what will follow and the War of Wrath at the very end of the First Age. What I like is that Galadriel here has a good reason to leave Beleriand behind and start a family outside of it, where it's safe. She seems to see the war efforts of the elves as futile, and her counsel is not accepted. So why stay there and wait for the doom which she foresaw? If we look at the few information from Lord of the Rings, we don't know why she left Beleriand. We only have this quote, "For ere the fall of Nargothrond or Gondolin, I passed over the mountains," that are the Blue Mountains. Galadriel leaving is interestingly not directly mentioned in the Silmarillion itself, as far as I'm aware. So in it and in Lord of the Rings, we find no reason for it that is different in that last version. However, this was the third and last version of the story around the First Kinslaying. Both the first and this one contradict each other in many details, and this very late version even contradicts Lord of the Rings and The Road Goes Ever On. Keep in mind, Tolkien published a second edition of Lord of the Rings with small corrections in 1965, so 8 years before the last version was written. Some people now combine different versions, and for their personal headcanon that is totally fine, but keep in mind that this is then an interpretation and often not what Tolkien actually wrote explicitly. In this case, we have this other version in between from the late 60s, where we see Galadriel also fighting in Alqualonde, and Celeborn remains a Cinder Elf from Middle-earth. So this is similar to what we find in the Silmarillion, just far less detailed. We talk about 2 book pages in the Silmarillion versus 2 sentences. But it has a few additional information we don't find in the Silmarillion, so combining those writings kind of works in this case. Still, her motivations are a bit different. She wants, in addition to her pride and founding her own realm, to oppose Feanor in Middle-earth for what he did in Alqualonde. On top, the purpose of the second version are linguistic details and why Galadriel later uses certain consonants in her lament and Fëanor once trying to maintain the language tradition. A shibboleth is a language tradition that allows to differentiate one social group from another. The question, would the Noldor accept her as an early leader when she actively fought against them in battle, is not even touched in this text. Imagine it discussing language details and its historic background for 70% of the time, giving some historic context, and then somewhere in a short summary of the aftermath, Tolkien writes, "Oh, by the way, even after the merciless assault upon the Teleri and the rape of their ships, though Galadriel fought fiercely against Fëanor in defense of her mother's kin, she did not turn back." And that's it. Calling it a version is even a stretch if we compare that to 2 pages of story with even some dialogue we find in the Silmarillion. The difficulty of so many versions existing often make me phrase sentences like, "It's very likely that Galadriel fought in Alqualonde against the Noldor," instead of calling it a 100% fact. So, did Galadriel take part in the battle in Alqualonde during the First Age? It seems it was Tolkien's intention during his later life after 1968 that she did. If this idea already existed before in his mind is impossible to say without asking him personally, which is unfortunately not possible anymore. Keep also in mind that Tolkien wrote many texts before this date, and they might have been written from the perspective of her not playing any role in the kinslaying. There are more texts about Galadriel in the Unfinished Tales, but those cover the Second Age and only briefly mention what happened in the First Age. For example, a very prominent text is called Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, but it only reads because the people of Finarfin had no part in the kinslaying of Alqualonde, and she, Galadriel, became a friend of Melian. I would not count that as a version. Into this text about Galadriel and Celeborn in the Second Age and some other writings we will look in the upcoming parts. I hope I could untangle the version chaos a bit for this small section of Galadriel's life and give you all the needed information to form your own opinion on the matter. Thank you for watching. I have to admit, this video was very difficult to write and took a ton of iterations, which is the reason why I'm so late with it. I hope you found it interesting. If so, press the like button, leave a comment, maybe subscribe and recommend me to other Tolkien fans, and check my other detailed Tolkien lore videos on this channel. I link some of my lore video playlists in the description as well. Next lore video might be something small or the next part of Who is Elrond, where we slowly got to the time around the events of The Hobbit. Fitting to this, we have to start with our Peter Jackson, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings trilogy watch parties that we always have every year before Christmas. So I guess we have to start next week with it. And maybe we start with War of the Rohirrim this time, or I'm not sure, because I'm quite busy and getting another watch party in is quite difficult. Plus we also have to do some lore Q&A streams in between. So there will be a lot of content in this regard. I hope you look forward to that. Also, again, huge shout outs to all the supporters. Thank you and see you people next time. Goodbye.